So I might say a few things that might seem a little bit controversial or spicy. And
Good.
I'm doing it but I'm open to hearing responses that could help maybe rein me in a little bit. And it's going to be, I think, balanced. So hear me out. Like I'm going to say things about like communio and Thomism, and we're going to try to sift these together. But to be really spicy, could you say that Thomism is the original theologianology? Because that's the whole idea, is that no theology is done through reference to Thomas and this line of commentators. Whereas then the ressourcement movement was saying, no, we have a broad tradition, and there's nothing wrong with being more eclectic and saying, well, on this point, I like Athanasius. On that point, I like Chrysostom. On this point, I like Anselm. On that point, I like Bonaventure. On this point, I like Aquinas. And then making a mosaic out of the riches of the tradition you found instead of like a tight, like argumentation within one tradition. And that was sort of like the whole idea of ressourcement was, no, we're not bound to one particular school of one particular theologian. It's let's broaden this out. And then you sort of do make that mosaic in your research and you think, you know what, I've read through like these fathers of the East and West on this topic, but this particular one really strikes me as useful for my own exposition of dogmatics. And so on this point, I really follow his line, but on that point, I follow that line. But then on the other hand, the argument can come back now one might say that's actually what the high scholastics were doing as well. So in a certain sense, you could argue that ressourcement was saying, what Aquinas and Bonaventure were doing is perhaps what we should be doing now, where we become masters of the sacred page and learn about fathers East and West, and then we develop our synthesis without a priori giving precedence to a particular school. Now, but you could argue that was the first generation, but what about now are people who are in the general elan or general lineage of the ressourcement movement falling into creating their own commentatorial tradition, where their students now are only writing dissertations and stuff about the founders of the Communio school, right? And so now it's a commentatorial tradition of its own that is doing more theologianology, which was a critique of the original founders themselves about what was going on in Thomism. Now, of course, I think a Thomist response might be, well, yeah, but it's because Thomas did do the synthesis ahead of time. And because for me, this is where people who know me realize I'm like a tennis ball that goes back and forth over the net between one side and the other.
That's why we love you, Richard. Just so you know that. That's why.
But no, like there is this, because I see a real benefit in the idea of developing this line of thought in the school. Like I actually think that has a real value as well that shouldn't be forgotten, to have significant figures with great minds over the course of centuries developing this particular line of thought more fully, like is very valuable alongside the people who are a little bit more eclectic. And of course, the danger of eclecticism is coherence. And how do now, if Aquinas is the master of synthesis, he could prove that you can be coherent and be a little bit eclectic by quoting fathers from East and West and all that sort of thing. But anyway, those are sort of my thoughts. Are like, I think, but I think your major issue, I think, is correct, because at least my perception is that like a lot of dissertations nowadays are this figure on X, and that's, and I'm guilty of that myself. Mm-hmm. So like, and it seems to almost be the expectation. And I don't know if that's because it's easier to source what someone else said and what other people said about what that person said for the sake of having a large enough bibliography to justify a dissertation. And it's a little bit less, from what Father Pidell was saying, it puts a little bit of gap, because if I'm just telling my claim is what he said.
Yep.
I'm not making a claim about this, what I'm saying.
Yes, it's safer.
It's safer. Yeah. So there's a distance between that, where you have a buffer saying, well, I didn't say you're wrong. I just said this is what he said. And it creates that buffer zone. And it's less risky, because then you're not subjecting yourself And I think this is a real psychological thing too, where it's like, if the academy is the sort of laboratory of the science of theology, right? You need the sense of, I want to make a hypothesis that might very well be wrong, so I can get the feedback to see if it's right or wrong, without feeling personally attacked if it is wrong. But people feel like if I make a strong claim, and all of a sudden I get attacked by like a dozen scholars in this field, my career's over. And so there's a certain sense of, I don't want to do like a major work where I'm making a specific claim on something if it's going to open me up to ridicule and like I'm going to basically be shunned because I made this claim that ends up being attacked from all sides. And so I think that's part of it too. It's like, who wants to risk that, especially early on in one's career?